Hi, I'm Owen Swart from D20, and today I'd like to talk about something. I know I promised you guys I was going to do a Star Trek apologetics this week, but something else came up. Someone was asking me to do reviews about superhero movies and TV shows and that kind of thing. Now, to be honest, I'm not a big fan of reviews. I don't really care whether somebody likes something or doesn't, but I am interested to hear what people think about certain things uh, outside of just an aesthetic judgment. I like to know what people, what thoughts go through people's heads when they're going through the stuff that's interesting to me. So I figured I'd take the bait and I'd put out something that's not really a review, but it's an analysis of some superhero stuff that I've seen online and something that I think about. This is the kind of stuff that keeps me up at night. So today I'm going to be talking about, as I said, superheroes, specifically DC superheroes. So I've always been into superheroes since I was a small kid. I've loved the crap out of them. Superheroes thrill me almost as much as Star Trek does. But I've always had a slight preference for DC characters over Marvel. Something about them being a bit more iconic, less human and relatable, whatever the reason. DC has been my preferred favorite, but not by a lot. But the issue that I want to talk about today is something that relates specifically to DC. At least I haven't seen it in any of the Marvel content that I've seen, and I'm talking specifically about DC's TV stuff. So this is the television adaptation of DC's superhero content, and it seems to apply specifically to the superhero stuff, not the other stuff. I mean, there's some really cool other content that DC have put out, things like iZombie and Lucifer and Gotham. That stuff is great, but that's not the stuff that's affected by the issue I want to talk about today. So DC, as I said, has got a huge array of really cool superhero content available at the moment. As somebody who loves reading superhero stories but doesn't have a lot of time to get through all the comics that I want to get to, it's really gratifying that I get to now watch a wide variety of superhero stories on TV, either when I actually get some time to sit and watch TV, or I can have it on in the background while I'm playing video games or something like that. It's really, really cool to have access to all of that content whenever I want it. And there's a lot of it. I mean, any given week, there's at least 2 or 3 new episodes of some cool new superhero show. And a significant portion of that is from DC. But there's a puzzling thing that's come up more than once in DC's superhero TV content. And that's that they've made some very strange decisions. I'm just going to highlight one particular pattern that I've noticed and see what you guys think about it. So I was thrilled a few years ago. I think it's 6 years ago now, when I saw that DC had put out a new live-action Batman TV series. Now, I'm specifically not talking about Gotham here, because Gotham isn't about Batman. It's more about Jim Gordon than it is about Bruce Wayne. But even so, it's at a time of Bruce Wayne's life where he's not Batman yet. What this series was about was we actually got to see the Batman character out and jumping from rooftop to rooftop, fighting crime, being cool. And he had all the characteristics that we've come to recognize in the Batman character. We know that he's a billionaire. He has unlimited financial resources. He's bent on revenge. He's suffered a personal tragedy earlier on in his life, and now he's trying to take out his frustration and his mental anguish on the criminal element in the city around him. His unlimited financial resources give him access to all kinds of really cool gadgets. Plus, he's trained himself to be an expert at hand-to-hand combat. He has a sidekick and a chick in the chair. A chick in the chair, I don't know if that's a trope that anyone else uses, but that's what I call it. Specifically in Batman's case, I'm talking about Oracle. Oracle was originally Batgirl until she was paralyzed by the Joker, and at which point she became a different character, specifically named Oracle, where she would sit in a chair in a laboratory somewhere surrounded by computer screens, and she was on a constant comm link to Batman. So whenever he was out in the field, she was able to give him real-time information from her computer setup for whatever he needed for whatever mission that he was on at the time. Now, Oracle eventually regained the use of her legs and she went back to being Batgirl again, at which point Alfred Pennyworth was able to step in and fill in that sort of mission control function for Batman. But for a significant period there, Batman had both his sidekick, his Robin, or a succession of Robins actually, and his chick in the chair. He had a recognizable gallery of villains, for example, Ra's al Ghul, Deathstroke, Anarchy, Clock King, Solomon Grundy, a whole bunch of familiar characters that we've seen over and over again in Batman comics. In fact, if you pick up any given Batman comic, you have a significant chance of seeing any one of these major characters, because they're so familiar and they're so entrenched in the Batman mythos. He also has an extensive team of sidekicks. These are people that he's recruited over the years to fight by his side. He's had one Robin after another who've either stuck around and are part of his close team, or they've gone off on their solo careers. But there's another characteristic about this team of sidekicks, is that he has a shaky relationship with all of them. Although Batman is kind of a father figure to most of them, it's kind of a dysfunctional family relationship. But that's kind of what makes Batman comics interesting, at least the ones that feature his extended team, is to see this complex web of relationships and dynamics between these various characters, between them and Batman, and between them and each other. It's a really fascinating drama. So it was really, really cool to see this Batman live action series that had all of these familiar features in it. It was really gratifying as a superhero fan in general, and as a Batman fan in particular. But there was one thing that the Batman series was missing, which was the really strange thing, and that the thing it was missing was Batman. I'm talking about the Arrow series. So Arrow was based around another DC character, Green Arrow, which, granted, has a lot in common with Batman. They have some similarities. They're both billionaires. They're both bent on revenge and that kind of thing. But they're also different in a lot of important ways. But the live-action series version of Arrow, at least in the first couple of seasons, it's kind of drifted around a little bit since then, but at least the first few seasons were very definitely about Batman and not about Green Arrow. Yet it was Green Arrow on screen. It was a very strange decision that DC have made, and I've yet to see anywhere them even acknowledging having made that decision, let alone coming close to some kind of explanation of it. Now, don't get me wrong, Green Arrow is a cool character, and the show Arrow is pretty cool too. I enjoy it. I watch it every week. But I'm reminded almost every single episode that the show I'm watching isn't about Green Arrow, it's about Batman, and yet they've got the wrong guy on the screen. It's very strange. But this isn't the only example of it. So let me move on to the next one. So a couple of years ago, another series began, which was about Batwoman. And Batwoman she's perhaps a more obscure character, and I'm talking about Batwoman here, not Batgirl. They're two different characters. Batwoman is a perhaps more obscure character. You might not even recognize her unless you've spent some time digging around the DC universe. Things that define her as a character is she's the cousin of the male superhero. So she's the cousin of Batman. Kate Kane is cousins with Bruce Wayne. So what that means is she has a similar fortune, she has a similar background, and although he didn't actually recruit him into serving on the Batman team, she was inspired to take on the mantle of the Bat by observing him. If I remember correctly in the comics, she didn't actually know that Bruce Wayne was Batman before she put the mask on herself, but she saw what Batman was doing around town, and she realized that she had the resources, the training, the background to be able to pull off a similar enterprise, and she felt motivated to do so. So she capitalized on the work that Batman had already done, creating this Bat brand in the hearts and minds of the criminal element of Gotham City, and she took on the mantle of the Bat herself, obviously with her own particular element, her own flair, and her own style. But as the character developed, she began to work with the DEO, the Department for Extranormal Operations, which is a shadowy government agency that deals with supercrime. So alien invasions, ghosts, vampires, zombie apocalypses, various other things. She doesn't work on her own, although she operates in the field, usually as a solo unit. She reports to the DEO and she goes on missions for them. She's a little bit resentful of having to work with them at times, but she recognizes that she's able to do more good with them at her side, or behind her, than she could on her own. Another interesting thing about her is that she is a lesbian. She's one of the few major characters in the DC universe that is homosexual, and in particular she's dating Maggie Sawyer. Maggie Sawyer, for those who've spent any time reading DC Comics, you might recognize, is one of the most competent police officers in the DC universe. She first appeared, if I'm not mistaken, back in the 90s in Superman comics. She was the top cop in Metropolis. Over the years, she migrated over to Gotham City, where she met up with Kate Kane, and they began a relationship, one of the longer-lasting superhero relationships. I don't think they're still together anymore, but they were for quite some time. Another interesting thing about her is that even though her costume includes this long red wig, without the wig, she also is she's a redhead. She has red hair and she wears her hair in a bob style. Now, you'd ask why that's important. Well, I'll show you now, because I was really surprised when when the Batwoman TV series began. I think it was 3-4 years ago now. That once again, Batwoman wasn't included in the series. Instead, it was Supergirl. Now, they did make one important change. They split the character into two different ones. We've got Supergirl, who is the cousin of the male superhero, inspired by him but not recruited by him, and works for the DEO. And then they created a separate character, a sister, Alex Danvers, who is Supergirl's adopted human sister. As far as I know, she doesn't exist in any other version of the character. She was created specifically for the series. But she's the one who's the lesbian who's dating Maggie Sawyer, and she's a redhead who wears her hair in a bob style. In fact, she looks almost exactly like Kay Kane from that picture that we just saw in the previous slide. Now, the Supergirl TV series, love it or hate it, I think it has some problems, but it has some good stuff about it too. The version of the character that's in that series, to me, doesn't resemble any other version of Supergirl I've ever seen in any other manifestation of the character. I mean, superficially, she resembles her. Obviously, she's wearing the suit. She has Superman's powers for the most part. But character-wise, she's completely different. Supergirl has always been one of my favorite superheroes because she has this really interesting inner turmoil going on. Supergirl, for those who aren't familiar with the background story, is she's Superman's cousin, Kal-El's cousin, Kara Zor-El. She comes from the planet Krypton. But unlike Superman, she didn't come to Earth as a baby. She came as a teenager. In fact, she was a teenager when she left Krypton, and her age was frozen while she was in the capsule. And when she arrived at Earth, her capsule got knocked off course, so she arrived at Earth much later. Her young cousin, her baby cousin Kal-El, had grown up, but she'd remained a teenager. And here she was now living in this strange new world, which she came to as almost an adult. And luckily she had her cousin Kal-El to sort of guide her and help her acclimatize to Earth. But what she lacked was this Kal-El's, or at least Clark Kent's, sense of being a native of Earth. Although he knew he wasn't from here, Earth was the only home that he ever knew. He felt more human than he did Kryptonian, even though obviously he was aware that he was Kryptonian. But Kara, or Supergirl, she actually remembered growing up on Krypton. She knew her Kryptonian parents, and so the separation from her homeworld, although she was one of the few survivors, she has suffered this tremendous trauma in her formative years. And this is something that she has to deal with now that she's on Earth. Not only is she dealing with that, but she's dealing with just being a teenage girl and the emotional instability that comes inherently with that, and also with having these ridiculously over-the-top powers. She has all of Superman's powers. In fact, they often hint at the fact that she might even be more powerful than Superman. And all of this leads to an explosive mix of fascinating forces that tug her in multiple directions. So the Supergirl comics that I've read have always been really, really interesting, and how she processes all these different and interesting forces that are impacting her life and impacting her psyche and her world. But the Supergirl TV series has almost none of that. I mean, they have the same backstory where she came from Krypton as not quite a teenager, but at least as maybe a preteen. But now we don't meet her as she arrives on Earth. We meet her many years later. She's already acclimatized to what it was like on Earth. As I said, she's grown up with his sister Alex, and now she works for the DEO. So what's weird about it is that it's not Supergirl, not as we know it. This isn't for starters, this isn't about a girl. This is about a grown woman. Whereas Supergirl in the comics is definitely a girl. In other words, one might say that this is a better fit for someone like Batwoman, who is, as the name suggests, a mature woman who's already come into her own and makes her own way in the world. But anyway, I'm not going to get too deep into what I think about Supergirl in the series. Just that there's some really strange decisions that DC have made around this series, and it's not clear, and they haven't even acknowledged making those decisions. It's not clear why they've made them. But there's one more example that I want to get to and that is Steel. So back in the 1990s, one of my favorite superheroes then was was Steel. If you've ever read the comic books, the story arc around the death and rebirth, or death and resurrection of Superman, you'll be familiar with Steel. He was originally called the Man of Steel, and then later he shortened it just to Steel. Um, the thing that's interesting, well, the things that are interesting about Steel is that he's a black superhero. Now, I put that in quotation marks, not because it's not true. He actually is a black man. But there are a number of black superheroes where the fact that they're black is just kind of incidental. It's not part of who they are or their identity. This is somebody like Storm from the X-Men, or Blade, the vampire hunter. These are characters that just happen to be black. It's not really all that important most of the time that they are black. As opposed to another category of superheroes like Steel, or Luke Cage, or Black Panther, where their race is an integral part of their character. It's something that they deal with every day, and it's something that's important to them. So, Steel is a black superhero. He has a suit of armor that makes him fly, kind of like Iron Man. Steel, or John Henry Irons, is an engineer. He's a weapons designer. He built himself this suit that gives him some superpowers: the ability to fly, super strength. He has a nail gun in the one arm, and a really cool hammer that that attaches to his back. But the important thing is that he has the suit of armor, and that's where he gets his power from. He is a leader in his community. So John Henry Irons, as I said, he's an engineer, but he comes from I wouldn't quite call it a poor background, but he comes from the hood. He comes from urban DC, which is not a very affluent neighborhood. And when we see him in his solo title after the whole Death and Return of Superman story arc, we see him returning to DC and re-engaging with his home community, the people that he grew up with in his extended family. But because he's an engineer and because he's made something of his life, they all look up to him, and they see him as a hero in his own right, not just as a superhero, but as a leader, as a role model, as somebody that people should be paying attention to. But as is too often the case, both in real life and in the pages of various comic books, he has to deal with gangsters in his neighborhood. As I said, it's a relatively poor neighborhood, and organized crime is an issue, especially when it comes to drugs. And that's something that Steel has to deal with, both as John Henry Irons and as Steel. But the gangsters in his particular neighborhood, they are selling drugs that give kids temporary superpowers, or super strength and aggression. If you've read Batman, especially in the 90s, but also since then, you may be picking up a trend that I got into comic books in the 90s, so a lot of my favorite references are from that decade. But as I was saying, Batman in the 90s, he faced a villain called Bane, who took a drug that made him super strong, which then allowed him to beat Batman in hand-to-hand combat. The drug that Bane takes is called Venom, and this drug that was being sold in the streets of DC in the Steel comic book was also Venom, or at least it was a version of Venom. And so Steel, as a superhero, as a superpowered being, it fell to him to do what the cops couldn't, was to take down these kids who were taking this modified venom, and to try and stem the tide of this drug that was flooding the streets of his hometown. So I was thrilled a few months ago when the Steel TV series began. Except that, of course, it wasn't a Steel TV series, it was Black Lightning. Now, Black Lightning is an interesting choice as well, because although some of these things do apply to him, I mean, he's a black superhero, he's a leader in his community, and he, at least in various comics, has also had to deal with gangsters in his neighborhood. The one thing that Black Lightning's never really had was a suit of armor that makes him fly. But then in the TV series, he does. Now, Steel and Black Lightning, once again, although they have elements in common, they're quite distinct as characters. And it's mystifying to me that DC would make such a weird substitution. Make a TV series about Steel, who, at least in my opinion, is the more interesting of the two characters, and replace him with Black Lightning. But why? I mean, Black Lightning and Steel are both pretty obscure characters. At least they are now. And I know that Black Lightning was fairly popular back in the 70s and early 80s. But he's been out of the spotlight for a very long time. At this point, Black Lightning and Steel are probably equally famous, or at least equally not well known. So why choose one over the other? Does it have something to do with that failed Shaquille O'Neal Steel movie that came out 15 or so years ago, which was it was not a good adaptation. Let's just be honest. It was terrible. But then why? I mean, Steel is already is more recent in the public consciousness. Wouldn't that be a better choice? Fact is, we don't know. Fact is that DC won't even acknowledge that they have substituted one character for the other, let alone explain their decision to do so. And it's puzzling, and I don't understand it. I don't have an answer. Maybe you do. Maybe you know. Maybe you have access to information that I don't. If you do, please drop it in the comments below. Because I don't want to be casting aspersions here. Now, any one of these characters or any one of these series, they have their good points and they have their bad points, and I watch them all anyway because I just can't get enough superhero stories. Even superhero stories that leave me with unanswered questions, I'll watch them anyway because I can't get enough superheroes. But maybe you have some insight, maybe you have some conjecture, some ideas around why you suspect DC have made these what I think are very strange decisions. And if so, please drop them in the comments below, or you can find me on Facebook or on Discord. If you'd like to see more of this kind of content, you can support me on Patreon. That's patreon.com/D20. A couple of dollars a month would go a long way to helping me produce more content. If there's something else you'd like me to cover in these videos, or if you want me to do a rant or a Star Trek apologetics about something in particular, please hit me up on any of those platforms, and I'll do my best to add it to the list. Otherwise, until